Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. What is an interesting read from Boxing Scene via Melissa Smith, women's boxing historian, that says the truth is Saudi Arabia doesn't care about women's boxing. It seems like a token gesture, like they're saying, look, we have women on the card, but the bigger picture is concerning, Smith told BoxingScene.com. We've seen some women's bouts, like when Ramla Ali fought on an Anthony Joshua card. Smith questioned whether this involvement would truly support women's boxing, and if someone believing the Saudi Arabian influx of capital could run boxing in the short term. She has concerns around what the future of women's boxing could be. The Saudis are talking about launching a boxing league, signing major promoters, and putting the sport on the map, Smith said. Where are the women in these discussions? This league is all about men.
Maybe it is.
But it's their money, and it's their right to use what fighters and do what fights they see fit that is conducive towards generating capital.
It's not a given.
No one is entitled, and no one has been as supportive, I think, of women in sport, women in boxing, than this channel. Throughout the YTBC, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a content creator that reports on these fights and these fighters with as much regularity as I do, but I do so with the understanding that the average boxing fan doesn't really care, doesn't want to know.
And that's their prerogative. You can't chastise them for it.
Melissa says the world has always been tougher for women, but even harder for those who are fighters. Smith raised concerns about the impact on female fighters. What happens when all the top male fighters are fighting under this league, and the women who typically share fight cards with them are left out, Smith asked. Will promoters step up and give women their own platforms as main events? I doubt it. Well, if it's any consolation, Terry Harper and Rhiannon Dixon just headlined a show. Sandy Ryan and Michaela Mayer also headlined a show.
And it brought very good metrics to the ESPN platform, by the way. We talked about that.
It's not all doom and gloom. The disconnect is feeling entitled, thinking that the promoters and the powers that be have to do this. They don't have to do this, and that's what I think some of the activists don't really understand. It's not your right to be promoted by Matchroom or Queensberry or Boxer. That is not a right. It's not your right to fight in Saudi Arabia and what shows they put together. That's not a right.
It's not an entitlement, but you're talking about it like it is.
Even with fights like Clarissa Shields versus Savannah Marshall, which was one of the most exciting matchups we've seen, getting a rematch has been a struggle. It has, but that's down to the fighters, isn't it?
That's down to Clarissa wanting the rematch to happen in America where there's not as much money or interest in the fight. That's not down to the promoters.
Boxer would have been happy to pay for a rematch in the UK, where they're based out of. It was Clarissa that wanted it in America. You can't put that on the promoters. If promoters cared about women's boxing, we'd see a woman on every fight card. Smith concluded by expressing frustration with the current state of the sport, as Daniel Dubois stopping Anthony Joshua is another missed opportunity for a talented fighter to get a major opportunity. Take Daniel Dubois' sister Carolyn. She's an incredible talent, a future Hall of Famer.
Future Hall of Famer. She hasn't even fought for a full title yet. You don't think you're jumping the gun?
But she wasn't on the same card as her brother's big fight.
Huh?
That makes no sense. The truth is, they don't care about women's boxing. If they did, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
I think Melissa Smith's intentions are good, but her logic is flawed. You're saying that because Daniel fought on a big show, his sibling should have been on it.
For no reason other than that's his sibling? I mean, are you expecting Charlie Edwards to fight on all the same shows as Sonny Edwards?
They're siblings.
Were you expecting that Andre Durrell should have fought on all the same shows as his brother Anthony?
They're siblings.
Fernando Vargas has about 3 kids. All 3 of them box, but all 3 of them don't box on the same shows, and they're siblings. So what kind of rationale are you using? That Carolyn should have been given a slot, given a spot on that card, for no reason other than her big brother's fighting?
Her big brother and father, who she's not getting along with right now, by the way. They're not on speaking terms due to the whole Shane McGuigan falling out thing. She stayed with Shane, and I guess they didn't want her to.
Let me condense the argument. Women's boxing and women boxers need less activism, less activists, and more customers. Because at the end of the day, it's all entertainment. You know, I don't support these women fighters because it's the right thing to do, the virtuous thing to do. I'm not virtue signaling.
I support them because they're entertaining. I find their fights entertaining. So when you look at it through that lens, you have a better understanding of what needs to be done.
But don't try to turn this into a DEI thing, an inclusivity thing. You're not owed a slot on any of these big shows. You're not owed fandom and patronage. You're not owed anything, and it's the same for the men.
You think it's different when it's not.
It's like the equal pay argument we've heard so much about. When all the men don't make the same money as all the other men, you think everybody's making what Canelo's making? Do you think every super bantamweight is making what Inoue is making? They aren't. There is no such thing as equal pay.
So once you understand that, and you look at it as a business, from a business perspective, you know what needs to be done.
The potential that I've always seen in women's boxing is not getting the guys to become fans of these fighters. No, not that.
Some won't, and some will. Some already have. Some have come around.
But the real potential is getting the women on board. That other audience that maybe they don't watch a whole lot of boxing, but they see a girl, they might identify with her, they like the way she fights or where she's from, what have you, and they lend their support to the sport. That's the potential.
Recruiting that audience.
You can't get all caught up being entitled. The way you gotta look at it is, you're not entitled to anything, and you need to get people on board. It's the same for the men.
How many fans you have directly affects how much money you make.
Matchroom hasn't stopped signing female fighters. They just signed Stephanie Pinedo, who's gonna be boxing on the undercard of Liam Pato versus Richardson Hitchens.
Queensberry hasn't stopped signing female fighters. They picked up Chantel Cameron after she left Matchroom.
She's gonna be boxing real soon against former champion Patricia Bergoult as part of a Queensberry promotion show. Now, could the promoters stand to do more for women in sport? Sure, but they have to have a vision. It has to be organic. It does have to come down to the fighter the same way it does for the men.
I think Top Rank would be the ideal place for a Makia Krebs or a Virginia Fuchs. I think Golden Boy would be a great place for Yadira Bustillos.
Marilyn Badillo. Matchroom is international. They operate in so many markets, they can pick up an Aussie like a Jazzy Parr or a Brit in Emma Doolin. The same applies to Ben Shalom or Frank and George Warren at Queensberry. There are a number of British fighters coming through that they can pick up, but the bottom line is, you don't do it just to do it. You do it with purpose. You do it because you see something and maybe the fighter could go all the way. Maybe you can turn them into a draw. But that's got to be there. It's got to be organic.
DEI hires don't work in the sport of boxing because you can sign whoever you want to sign, but that don't mean people want to see them.
Still a big supporter of women's boxing. Still a big believer. I think it can be bigger and it can be better. But don't get it in your head you're entitled to anything. Because you're not.
Nobody is.
Not the men and not the women. Nobody's entitled to nothing. In men's light heavyweight news, seemingly confirmation of what I already thought, I already knew. It would seem that Mr. Anthony Yarde has jumped ship at Queensberry to swim over to the shores of Boxer, as he is set to make his next ring appearance on the undercard of Adam Azim's next fight. Adam Azim was promoted by Boxer.
What a coinky dink.
Anthony was last in action in February of this year on the undercard of Shiraz versus Williams, a Queensberry Promotions show. And afterwards we start hearing about legal trouble, legal woes, some dispute between him and Frank Warren and Queensberry. Same kind of stuff we started hearing about Lawrence Okolie and Eddie Hearn before he jumped ship, and I immediately knew what was going on. Ben Shalom has gone ahead, gone in this guy's ear, whispering sweet nothings in it, making promises about what he'll make per fight if he goes to Boxer. So all of a sudden,
there's a contract dispute. Queensberry says Anthony owes them a fight. Anthony says otherwise. He wants to do other things.
You know what time it is? You may be telling yourself that Anthony Yarde likely did this with the Joshua Buatsi fight in mind. That in order to get it done, he went to Boxer, but he didn't have to go to Boxer to get that fight done. Remember, all the UK promotional outfits are working with each other now, more or less, that you didn't have to leave Queensberry to make a fight with Joshua Buatsi.
Just because he's with Boxer doesn't mean you have to go to Boxer. Frank's done right by this guy. He's been good to him.
I think he has. He got him not just one, but 2 world title opportunities. Years ago with Sergey Kovalev and years later with Artur Beterbiev. And even though he lost, even though he came up short, he didn't cast him aside. He didn't cut him. Even after he lost to Lyndon Arthur,
he stood by him.
When he lost to Sergey Kovalev,
he stood by him.
And when he lost again to Artur Beterbiev. He stood by him. He didn't cut him. He didn't cast him aside. He didn't treat him like a piece of trash.
No.
Got him a rebound fight. He actually got him 2 rebound fights. One in September of last year, and another in February of this one.
He's on a 2-fight winning streak right now. He's going to be facing an opponent that has yet to be announced on the undercard of Adam Azim versus O'Hara Davies.
I'm not surprised. For the longest time now, it seems like Ben Shalom has been trying to rebuild Matchroom on Sky Sports. His own version of it, targeting a lot of fighters that you normally saw on Matchroom shows. He didn't normally go after Frank Warren's boys, Frank Warren's guys.
Not really, not until now.
Powerful enemy. I don't know that you want to go peeing in Bricktop's cornflakes. I don't know that you want to go doing that, but you did it, and it just is what it is.
You often hear me talk about promoters and fighters and what goes on behind the scenes, the scumbags. That yeah, sometimes the promoters are scumbags, but other times it's the fighters.
That yeah, sometimes the promoters are underhanded and sneaky, but other times it's the fighters that are underhanded and sneaky. I mean, this whole time, you don't think Anthony Yarde's been communicating with Ben Shalom behind Frank Warren's back?
Yeah, sometimes the promoters are greedy, other times the fighters are greedy.
See it all the time. It's a very romantic notion to assume that the promoters are always the bad guys and the fighters are always the good guys. That the fighters would never do anything underhanded, anything sneaky.
Sketchy.
This didn't happen overnight. This happened over weeks, months. Anthony Yarde planning to jump ship from Queensbury over to Boxer, his departure, even if it meant getting into a contract dispute with the promoter that stood by him through all his ups and downs. I hear people talk about this stuff like it's only the promoters that are selfish. Sometimes the fighters and their teams are selfish. Sometimes. Is Anthony well within his rights to leave Queensbury, to go to Boxer? Is he within his rights to go to a different promoter? That's for the lawyers to decide.
But assuming that he is...
All right, you're within your rights. But sometimes the promoters are within their rights to do the stuff that they do, and all they get is guff about it.
Well, they're not the ones taking the punches. The fighters are.
Yeah, but the fighters aren't the ones investing their money. They may be investing their time, their blood, their sweat, and their tears, but before they get there, a promoter has to invest in them. Invest in a fighter, a fight, a show, a career.
They may not be the ones taking all the punches, but don't assume that they're not taking risks. They're taking risks too.
Perhaps not the same ones as the fighters, though all the same. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
I think Frank and Queensbury have been very good to Anthony Yarde. This is how he thanks them. It just is what it is.
So maybe that's bad news for Frank, not bad news for us. This brings us closer to a Yarde versus Buatsi fight, and I do want to see that fight. Big domestic clash in the UK, and I love my UK domestic clashes.
Right.
Ben Shalom, having both boxers under his banner, is likelier to make the fight, want to make the fight, because for him it's a win-win, irrespective of who wins. But if one of the guys is on some other side of the street, he'll be hesitant, like he has been with Carolyn Dubois and Beatrice Ferreira.
Like he was with Fabio Wortley and Fraser Clark when Matchroom was in the picture. He didn't make the fight until they weren't in the picture anymore.
Then he made it. So the good news for us, the boxing fans, is we're one step closer to a Yarde versus Buatsi fight. I anticipate we're probably going to see Anthony in 1 or 2 gimme fights before he makes the Buatsi fight. What does Joshua Buatsi do in the meantime?
Grow his beard.
Watch paint dry. Joshua Buatsi don't keep the most active schedule to begin with, so, you know.
He's no stranger to going on holiday when he should be fighting. It's not bad news for us. Maybe for Frank.
All I'm telling you is it's not one way. It's what I've been saying. And finally, in men's heavyweight news, as it pertains to a potential Anthony Joshua versus Daniel Dubois rematch, Eddie Hearn says, I think it would be part of the Riyadh season in Riyadh. Riyadh season runs from October, end of, till February and early March. Anything within that period takes place in Riyadh. It would be a part of Riyadh season if it were to happen. And if they wanted it to happen, if they wanted it to be that way and happen there, you have to imagine that the event coordinators would put up considerable money to do it.
More than Daniel would get fighting someone else. Recently we talked about how George Warren seemed non-committal to doing a rematch with Anthony. That's not necessarily locked in, but when you consider the money that Daniel could make.
More than he'd make rolling the dice with Joseph Parker and Zile Zhang and Martin Bacoli and whoever else is out there that wants a piece of him, the Joshua fight pays better. It's bigger.
Whether you think Anthony deserves a rematch or not.
The almighty dollar has a way of convincing people. and I think it could convince Daniel to run it back, especially the way that he won. Anthony was never in that fight. He beat him in lopsided fashion, floored him. What was it, 3, 4 times?
There's a chance that he wins?
Revenge in Riyadh for Anthony Joshua? It's possible, I think. It's possible because the Daniel Dubois that showed up was the one that I expected to show up. Gung-ho, guns blazing, swinging for the fences, trying for big punches. A guy like that can be countered, he can be floored. Anthony did hurt him at least once off a big right hand right before he got stopped. So he knows he can hurt Daniel.
Of course Daniel knows he can hurt Anthony, but Anthony knows he can hurt Daniel.
If he patches up the holes, tightens up his defense, doesn't make the same mistakes he made before, because it's the mistakes that costed him the fight, fighting with his hands so low.
No Harrison Ford, no pun intended.
When he got caught with that big right hand at the end of the first round, or the other right hand he got caught with while trying for an uppercut, before he was in position to land it, without the left hand at home.
It's the things that just didn't need to happen. These defensive lapses in judgment. If he can tighten up, he has the tools to win, but does he have the psychology, the mindset? Immediately after the fight, he takes to his social media messages of staying positive and staying upbeat, putting on a brave face. But being honest,
Do it.
It's hard. It's very hard to have faith in Anthony.
You know that even if he goes in there and he wins, he avenges the loss, it still means it took you 2 fights, what I thought you would do in 1. It still means the same thing.
No armchair critic. I'm not criticizing him. What I'm saying is my evaluation of the fighter, it has changed.
I don't got the same faith in this kid that I had before. And even if he goes in there and wins, well, you needed 2 fights to do what I thought you would do in 1.
This was one of the easier ones, I thought. If this is what happened with Daniel, what happens with Martin Bakoli? What happens with Zile Zhang?
They're not the only ones. There are other guys coming through, like Ivan Ditchko, like Bakadir Jalalov.
They're not the only ones.
And the effect of all of this is every guy that Anthony Joshua faces moving forward is going to have it in their head that I ain't got to land on this guy but once. Once I land on this guy, he don't recover too good. Because this kid is worth so much money, and because he's perceived as having a glass jaw, there's going to be no shortage of guys that want to fight him and are willing to try him, irrespective of what he brings to the table, because he is strong, and he is a good boxer, but he can be gotten to.
Everybody knows.
So they're going to try him, and that is in a best-case scenario where there actually is a rematch and Anthony wins. If Anthony wins, maybe they do a trilogy?
Trilogy?
Think about it. If Usyk beats Fury for a second time, I don't think Fury comes back right away. Who does Anthony face in the in-between time? Maybe he faces Daniel again.
Trilogy with Daniel would make a lot more sense than a trilogy with Usyk. Usyk won the first 2. Whereas if Anthony wins, he's 1-1 with Daniel.
Third fight would be the tiebreaker. There's a precedent for it. We've seen more pointless trilogies than that one.
Getting ahead of ourselves talking about trilogies. Anthony's got to win the second fight if there even is a second fight. Do you trust him to do it?
If they make it, do you think he can deliver?